The Rhine in March 1945 was more than a river. It was the last convincing lie the Third Reich could still tell itself, that a strip of cold, fast water could stop the end of the world. For centuries, the river had guarded the German heartland. Now, in the final weeks of the war, it carried the weight of a dying regime's delusion, that time could still be bought, that a miracle might yet arrive. On the western bank, north of the Ruhr, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery was building the opposite kind of truth: certainty through preparation. Operation Plunder was not an assault so much as a demonstration of control. Thousands of artillery pieces stood wheel to wheel. Pontoons, assault boats, and amphibious vehicles waited in disciplined rows. Engineers marked every meter of the crossing zone. Airborne divisions rehearsed their drop zones down to the second. Nothing was left to chance because chance, Montgomery believed, had already cost too many lives. He spoke to his senior staff in a calm voice edged with steel. "We cross the Rhine the way we cross every obstacle, methodically, overwhelmingly, and with the minimum loss of life. Every gun will fire. Every boat will launch on schedule. Every man will know his place. This is not a gamble. This is mathematics." Montgomery had seen too many young men fed into the machine of haste. Patience, he was convinced, had brought the Allies this far. Haste had buried a generation in the mud of Flanders. He would not repeat that crime. The soldiers under his command, British, Canadian, and attached American units, felt the weight of that philosophy. They smoked, cleaned rifles, wrote last letters. A young lance corporal from Yorkshire stared at the gray water and muttered to his mate, "All this lot feels like we're throwing the whole bloody empire at one river." His mate shrugged. "Monty knows what he's doing. Better slow and safe than fast and dead." 200 miles south the mood was different, though no one on the northern bank knew it yet. That afternoon, Winston Churchill arrived in a convoy of staff cars. He stepped out, heavy overcoat buttoned against the damp chill, cigar already glowing. At 69, the war had carved deep lines into his face, but his eyes still burned with the need to see history made. He had come to witness what he believed would be Britain's final, grand set piece, the ceremonial breaching of Germany's ancient moat. Montgomery greeted him with formal courtesy. They walked together along the riverbank, aides trailing at a respectful distance. Churchill's voice boomed as he gestured across the water. "Bernard, this is one for the annals. The Rhine, the line that held Caesar, that stopped Napoleon's marshals. Tomorrow night, we shall cross it in strength, and the world will see that Britain still knows how to finish a war." Montgomery answered evenly. "Prime Minister, the plan is complete. Tomorrow at dusk, 4 hours of concentrated bombardment, then the airborne drop at first light, then the assault waves under smoke and covering fire. We have rehearsed every phase. There will be no surprises." Churchill nodded, puffing smoke. "Splendid. I like surprises only when they happen to the other fellow." In his mind, Churchill was already framing the moment. This was how wars should end, not in chaos, but in order. The Allies had paid enough in blood for reckless brilliance. Let this be the victory of reason over haste. They paused near a cluster of 25-pounder guns. Churchill watched the crews check sights and fuses. The smell of wet wool, gun oil, and wood smoke hung in the air. Somewhere a soldier sang a snatch of a music hall tune, quickly hushed. Churchill turned to Montgomery. "You have my complete confidence. When the barrage begins tomorrow, I shall be watching from the best vantage point you can find me. The British people deserve to see their soldiers cross this river in triumph." "I'll arrange it, sir," Montgomery replied. "You'll have a clear view and complete safety." Churchill smiled, but his eyes drifted back to the water. The Rhine flowed on, indifferent, its current carrying the last light of day downstream. Behind them, the preparations continued under floodlights. Generators hummed, officers called orders. Trucks ground through mud. The machine of war moved with the slow, deliberate certainty of a glacier. That evening, Churchill dined in Montgomery's headquarters caravan. Over brandy and cigars, the conversation turned to the broader campaign. Eisenhower's forces in the south were pressing hard, but the main effort, everyone agreed, must come here, where the British Commonwealth could claim the decisive blow. Churchill raised his glass. "To the final river crossing of this war, may it be as memorable as it is inevitable." Montgomery clinked glasses. "And may it cost us as little as possible." As night deepened, the riverbank grew quieter. Sentries paced. Stars appeared between clouds. The artillerymen slept beside their guns. Churchill lay awake in his quarters, listening to the river's low murmur. He thought of other rivers, the Marne, the Aisne, the Somme, and of the men who had crossed them at terrible cost. This time, he told himself, it would be different. This time they had learned. We have the men, the guns, the plan. Caution has carried us from El Alamein to the German border. It will carry us across this last obstacle. Yet even as he thought it, a faint unease stirred. The war had taught him that certainty was often the prelude to surprise. He pushed the thought aside. Tomorrow would prove the wisdom of patience. Far to the south, in the American sector near Oppenheim, the night was darker, and the preparations far less visible. No floodlights, no massed artillery, just a few quiet trucks, some canvas assault boats, and a commander who believed waiting was a greater sin than failure. While Montgomery's army group rehearsed its symphony of firepower, George S. Patton had already read the reconnaissance reports showing weak German defenses. A narrow window, a chance that would vanish by morning. He stood in his command post, map spread before him, cigarette burning down to the filter. His staff waited. The decision formed in silence, sharp and final. 200 miles south, a decision had already been made, and no one could stop it. 200 miles south of Montgomery's meticulously orchestrated frontier, the Rhine ran quieter. The banks here were steeper, the current faster, the night colder. No floodlights pierced the darkness. No endless rows of artillery waited in perfect alignment. Just shadows, the low murmur of the river, and the forward positions of the U.S. Third Army near Oppenheim. George S. Patton stood alone in his command trailer, coat unbuttoned, a cigarette glowing between his fingers. Maps covered the table. Fresh reconnaissance photographs lay scattered across them. Grainy black and white images showing thin German defenses, tired troops, half-empty trenches, abandoned outposts. Intelligence confirmed what the pictures suggested. The enemy had stripped this sector bare to reinforce the north, convinced the decisive blow would fall where Montgomery was massing his thousands of guns. Patton stared at the photographs longer than usual. His staff waited outside in silence. They knew better than to interrupt when he stood like this. Motionless, calculating, the volatile energy coiled rather than exploding. He knew exactly what caution demanded. Wait for coordination. Wait for bridging equipment. Wait for Eisenhower's approval and Bradley's blessing. Preserve coalition harmony. Let Montgomery have his set piece in the north. No one would blame him for patience this close to victory. But Patton also knew something else. By morning, the Germans would realize their mistake. Reserves would rush south. The window would slam shut. Another fortnight of planning, another deliberate assault, more lives spent to achieve what could be taken tonight. He thought of the young soldiers outside, men who had fought from the beaches of Normandy through the frozen hell of the Bulge to this river, men who could already taste peace. If he waited, the war might drag on another month. More boys would die in ones and twos across pointless skirmishes while planners argued over timetables. Waiting killed quietly. It always had. He crushed the cigarette under his boot and called in his chief of staff, Brigadier General Hobart Gay. "What's the latest from the engineers on those canvas boats?" he asked, voice low. "Enough for 2 battalions in the first wave, sir," Gay replied. "Fragile as hell, but they'll float. Proper bridging material won't be ready until tomorrow night at the earliest. And opposition? Spotty. A few machine gun nests. Some artillery batteries that haven't fired in days. They're not expecting visitors." Patton nodded slowly, eyes still on the map. Then the words came, flat and final. "We're going tonight." Gay hesitated only a fraction of a second. "Tonight, sir? Without higher authority?" "Authority is what you take when the moment offers it," Patton said. "Get Manton Eddy on the line. Tell him V Corps crosses at 2200 hours, silent. No preparatory barrage, infantry first, engineers behind. We seize the far bank before the Germans know we're coming. And when Schaeff asks questions later? Then I'll answer them. But I won't answer to history for hesitation." The order rippled outward into the night. Radios whispered in code. Trucks moved without lights. Soldiers of the 5th Infantry Division, veterans hardened by months of combat, received the news in ditches and ruined farmhouses. A sergeant gathered his platoon in the darkness. "We're crossing tonight," he told them. "Quiet. No shooting unless shot at. Paddle like your life depends on it. Because it does. A 19-year-old private spoke up, voice tight. Sarge, I thought the big show was up north with Monty. The sergeant gave a tired grin. Yeah, well, old blood and guts doesn't like waiting his turn. Down at the riverbank, the canvas boats were manhandled into position. Thin, flexible, overloaded with men and equipment, they looked absurdly fragile against the black water. Soldiers climbed in carefully, rifles held high, paddles distributed. No one spoke above a whisper. The only sounds were the creak of stretched canvas, the soft splash of test strokes, and the endless rush of the river. Patton walked to the water's edge to watch the first wave prepare. The cold cut through his coat. He lit another cigarette, cupping the flame against the wind. In the faint glow he saw young faces, some eager, most afraid, all trusting him with their lives. He knew what failure would mean. Boats capsizing in the current. Men drowning under the weight of their gear, screams carrying across the water to alert the defenders, a bridgehead that never formed. His name forever linked not to victory, but to reckless gamble. Career ended in disgrace. Worse, the knowledge that those boys had paid the price for his certainty. He thought of Eisenhower, balancing coalition politics, of Bradley, steady and loyal, who would be furious at the breach of protocol, of Montgomery, already imagining the clipped outrage from the north. They would say he had endangered everything for personal glory. Maybe they were right, but glory was not the point. Speed was. The war ended fastest when one side lost the will to continue. Tonight he intended to take that will away. A young lieutenant approached through the darkness and saluted. First wave ready, sir. Awaiting your word. Patton looked at him for a long moment, seeing the fear behind the discipline. Tell them good luck, he said quietly. And tell them to move fast once they hit the far side. The lieutenant disappeared back into the shadows. Patton remained on the bank long after the first boats pushed off. He listened to the paddles biting the icy water, faint, rhythmic, then fading into the current. No shots yet, no flares lighting the sky, just silence, heavier than any artillery barrage he had ever ordered. Back in his trailer he paced, coffee untouched, cigarette after cigarette burned down to the filter. The radio net crackled with brief reports. Wave 1 midway, Wave 2 launching, no opposition sighted. The clock ticked past midnight. March 22nd became March 23. Far to the north, Montgomery's thousands slept beside their guns, confident in tomorrow's perfect plan. Churchill dreamed of a triumphant crossing witnessed in daylight under a storm of friendly fire. Here in the dark, a different history was already moving across the water. The boats were in the current now, soldiers bent to their paddles, faces pale in the faint starlight. The far bank loomed closer, black, silent, waiting. Once the boats were moving, there would be no explanation. Only consequences. The boats moved out into the current one by one, fragile shadows on black water. Canvas creaked under the weight of overloaded men. Paddles bit into the icy river with soft, rhythmic splashes that seemed deafening in the silence. No artillery softened the far bank, no flares lit the sky, no engines roared. Just the rush of the Rhine itself and the labored breathing of soldiers who knew this war was supposed to be nearly over. In the lead boat, a young corporal from Kansas gripped his paddle and stared at the approaching eastern shore. He had crossed rivers before, but never like this. Never in darkness. Never without the thunder of guns to announce their coming. He thought of home, of his mother's letters promising that he would be back by spring planting. He thought of the extra weight of his pack, how it would drag him under in seconds if the boat capsized. Most of all, he thought of how unfair it felt to die now, anonymously, days or weeks before the end. Beside him, his squad leader whispered, "Steady. Keep it quiet, we're almost there." No one replied. Words felt wasted in the cold. Further back in the wave, a private from New York prayed under his breath, the same prayer he had used since Normandy. He promised God everything, church every Sunday, no more drinking, money to the orphanage, if he could just reach the far bank dry. The river mocked him with its speed, pulling the frail boat sideways, forcing the men to dig deeper with their paddles. The current was stronger than the briefings had suggested. Boats drifted downstream faster than planned. Some scraped bottom early, grounding on unseen shallows. Men jumped out into waist-deep freezing water, gasping as the cold seized their legs. They hauled the boats forward by hand, boots slipping on mud, rifles held overhead. On the eastern bank, the German defenders slept, or smoked in their bunkers, or stared into the night expecting nothing. A few sentries paced, but their attention was turned northward, toward the distant rumble of Montgomery's preparations. They heard only the river, the same sound they had heard for weeks. The first Americans reached the far shore without a shot fired. They scrambled up the bank, boots sinking in soft earth, and dropped into the weeds. Rifles came up, eyes strained into darkness. Still nothing. One by one, the boats emptied. Men spread out in practiced formation, moving inland with the silence of hunters. Engineers followed, uncoiling ropes, preparing for the follow-on waves. The bridgehead began to form, not with explosions and drama, but with whispers and the click of safeties being flicked off. Back on the western bank, Patton listened to the radio reports trickling in. First wave ashore, no contact. Second wave landing 200 yards south of planned point, adjusting. Third wave launching now. Each message was brief, disciplined, calm. But Patton heard what lay beneath, the relief, the disbelief that it was working. He lit another cigarette and walked back to the water's edge. The night smelled of wet canvas and river mud. Somewhere out on the current, more boats were crossing, carrying the weight of his decision. He knew the margin was razor thin. One alert German patrol, one lucky flare, one machine gun opening up from a hidden nest, and the whole thing could collapse into slaughter. Men drowning, boats sinking, the river carrying bodies downstream toward Montgomery's perfect plan. But the reports kept coming. Positive, expanding. The far bank was being secured. By 200 hours, the first platoons had pushed inland half a mile. Abandoned German positions were taken without resistance. Prisoners began to trickle back, confused, half-dressed boys who had been asleep when the Americans appeared like ghosts. At 400, the engineers started work on a pontoon bridge under improvised lights. The bridgehead was holding, expanding. Dawn approached slowly, a pale gray line on the eastern horizon. The Rhine lay behind the Third Army now, no longer a barrier, but a highway. Patton finally allowed himself a small, fierce smile. He spoke to no one in particular. "We beat the bastards to it." But even as he said it, he felt the weight settle deeper. This was not the end of risk, only the beginning of consequences. Eisenhower would demand explanations. Montgomery would seethe. The coalition would strain, and if the Germans counterattacked in strength before the bridge was complete, the gamble could still turn to disaster. Out on the river, the last boats of the initial waves were landing. Soldiers looked back across the water toward the west, toward safety, and realized there was no going back now. The Rhine separated them from retreat as much as it had once separated them from victory. One young lieutenant, soaked to the waist, paused on the eastern bank and looked at the river he had just crossed. In the growing light, he saw the fragile canvas boats pulled up on the mud like beached whales. He thought of the men who had made it and the few who had not, swept away silently in the dark. He wondered why survival felt more fragile now than it ever had in the heat of battle. The war was almost won, yet death had never seemed closer. Across the water, far to the north, Montgomery's artillerymen were waking to begin their final preparations. Churchill would soon rise for breakfast, expecting to witness the grand spectacle later that day. Neither knew yet that the Rhine had already been crossed, that a single decision in the night had stolen the moment from them. By dawn, Hitler's river existed only on maps. Dawn broke cold and clear over the Rhine on March 23, 1945. On the eastern bank near Oppenheim, American engineers worked frantically under camouflage nets, linking pontoons into the first fragile bridge. Trucks and tanks began to roll across even before the structure was complete. The bridgehead was no longer a gamble. It was expanding hour by hour, swallowing German positions that had seemed impregnable only the day before. Word of the crossing reached Allied headquarters in fragments at first, then in a rush. Radio operators passed the initial reports up the chain with growing disbelief. Patton's Third Army had crossed the Rhine, in darkness, with assault boats, without authorization, and with almost no losses. At Supreme Headquarters in Reims, Dwight D. Eisenhower received the news over breakfast. He read the message twice, set it down, and rubbed his temples. Approval came quickly. He had no intention of ordering a withdrawal, but anger flickered beneath the surface. He summoned Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group, and the man caught between Patton's fire and coalition necessity. "George did it again," Eisenhower said, voice flat. "Crossed without clearing it with anyone. Not you, not me, not the British." Bradley exhaled slowly. He had expected something like this, yet the reality still hit hard. "Ike," he saw the opening and took it. "Germans were caught flat-footed. If we'd waited for full coordination, the sector would have been reinforced by now." Eisenhower nodded, but his jaw tightened. "That's not the point, Brad. Coalition warfare means coalition decisions. Monty's got half the British Commonwealth poised for the main effort. This steals his thunder and risks everything if it had gone wrong." Bradley offered no defense. He knew Patton would pay a price later, perhaps a reprimand, perhaps worse. But the river was crossed, and the strategic gain was undeniable. Farther north, in Montgomery's headquarters, the reaction was colder. An aide delivered the report just as the field marshal was reviewing final timings for Operation Plunder. Montgomery read in silence, face impassive, then placed the paper carefully on the table. "Patton has crossed at Oppenheim," he said at last, "with infantry in boats. No barrage, no airborne support." His chief of staff waited for the explosion that never came. Instead, Montgomery's voice was clipped, almost clinical. "Inform the Prime Minister, and tell 21st Army Group to proceed exactly as planned. We will not alter our timetable because of an American stunt." Privately, the wound ran deep. Montgomery had spent weeks building the perfect operation. Overwhelming force, minimal risk, maximum prestige. Now it felt like an afterthought. German reserves that might have opposed him were already shifting south. The narrative of the final campaign was slipping from British hands. But the deepest reckoning was yet to come. Winston Churchill rose late that morning in his quarters near Montgomery's command post. He dressed slowly, savoring the anticipation of the day ahead. The barrage was due to begin soon. He imagined the thunder of guns, the smoke, the waves of boats advancing under perfect control. A fitting climax to the European War. An aide knocked and entered with a tray of breakfast, tea, toast, marmalade, and a folded message marked urgent. Churchill spread marmalade on his toast, took a bite, then opened the paper. He read once, paused, read again. Patton's Third Army had seized a bridgehead across the Rhine during the night, intact, expanding rapidly, minimal casualties. The marmalade knife stopped halfway to the toast. For a long moment, Churchill said nothing. He stared at the river visible through the window, its surface now catching the morning light. The grand spectacle he had come to witness was still hours away, yet the Rhine had already been breached 200 miles south, in silence and shadow. He felt the collision inside him, admiration warring with unease. Patton had done what doctrine said could not be done. With fragile boats and raw nerve, he had shattered the myth of the Rhine as Germany's final shield. German morale would reel, reserves would scatter. The end of the war had just accelerated beyond any plan. And yet, the risk. The staggering, unforgivable risk. If the current had been stronger, if the Germans had been more alert, if a single machine gun had swept the boats, the river would have run red with American blood. Thousands might have died for one man's instinct. The alliance might have fractured under the weight of recrimination. Churchill set the message down and lit a cigar with deliberate care. He thought of Patton, the volatile genius who drove armies like racehorses, who feared hesitation more than death. He thought of Montgomery, meticulous and proud, wounded by this theft of moment. He thought of Eisenhower, juggling egos and nations. Most of all, he thought of the paradox now staring back at him. Patton's recklessness might save countless lives in the long run, by shortening the war, by breaking German will before the final slaughter. Yet it could only save lives because it had risked everything. Bold instinct had outrun careful planning, and history had pivoted in the dark. Churchill exhaled smoke toward the ceiling. He had spent years urging boldness on hesitant generals, demanding attack when others counseled caution. Now boldness had arrived uninvited, and he felt the chill of what it truly meant to live with such decisions. The barrage for Operation Plunder would still begin that evening. Montgomery would still cross in strength. The histories would record both crossings. But Churchill knew which one had truly broken the Rhine. Not overwhelming firepower, not perfect coordination, A man willing to act without permission, staking lives and reputation on judgment alone. He finished his tea in silence. History had not turned on a plan, but on a man willing to act. Weeks later, the war in Europe was racing toward its end. German armies crumbled on every front. The Rhine, once the Reich's final illusion of safety, now lay far behind the Allied advance. Cities fell in days rather than weeks. The bridgeheads, both the thunderous one in the north and the silent one in the south, had merged into a flood that nothing could hold back. On a bright April morning, Winston Churchill visited the Third Army sector. He had asked to see the place where the river had first been breached without permission. Patton, ever theatrical, arranged a dramatic gesture. The two men crossed the Rhine together on a pontoon bridge built over the original crossing site near Oppenheim. They stood side by side on the swaying planks, the river flowing beneath them. Engineers and soldiers saluted as they passed. Cameras recorded the moment for the newsreels. Churchill in his overcoat and hat, cigar in mouth, Patton ramrods straight in his polished helmet and ivory-handled revolvers. Churchill looked down at the water and spoke quietly, so only Patton could hear. "You pulled it off, George. Damned if you didn't." Patton allowed himself a small grin. "We caught them napping, sir. Simple as that." Churchill nodded, but his eyes were distant. He was thinking of the breakfast that morning weeks earlier. The marmalade paused mid-spread, the message that had upended everything he thought he understood about how wars end. He had admired the audacity then, and he admired it still. Patton's instinct had drawn German reserves away from Montgomery's front. It had shattered enemy morale when they realized their sacred river could be crossed in darkness with nothing more than canvas boats and nerve. It had shortened the war, perhaps by days, perhaps by weeks, and saved lives that would otherwise have been spent in the deliberate, costly advance doctrine demanded. Yet the admiration came laced with unease. Churchill had spent a lifetime urging boldness on cautious men. He had raged against hesitation, demanded attack when others counseled waiting. Now he had seen what pure boldness looked like when it was unleashed without restraint. One man's judgment against the combined wisdom of an entire headquarters structure. One decision that could have ended in catastrophe and disgrace. He glanced at Patton, standing proud beside him. History would remember the crossing as a triumph. The histories would list it alongside Montgomery's set piece, perhaps even footnote it as the spark that broke the Rhine first. Germany had feared the silent one more, because it proved their defenses were paper-thin when surprise arrived. But Churchill knew the fuller truth. Patton's gamble had succeeded not because it was safe, but because it was perilous. It worked only because the margin for error was almost non-existent. Another night, another sector, another commander, and the river might have claimed thousands in exchange for nothing. He thought of the young men who had paddled across in darkness, trusting a decision no plan had sanctioned. Some had not made it. Most had. All of them had been wagered on a single moment of judgment. Patton broke the silence. "War's about timing, Prime Minister. Wait too long and the chance is gone. Act too soon and you bleed for it. Somewhere in between is the right instant. You feel it or you don't." Churchill puffed his cigar and watched the smoke drift over the water. "And if you feel wrong?" he asked softly. Patton shrugged. "Then you pay the bill. But I'd rather pay for trying than for sitting still." Churchill said nothing for a long moment. He looked back across the river toward the west where the war had come from, then forward to the east where shattered Germany lay open. He had led his nation through 6 years of total war. He understood the loneliness of command, the weight of choices made in uncertainty. Yet this moment, this quiet crossing on a sunny April day, left him unsettled. Leadership was not glory. It was burden. It was choosing without guarantees, knowing that lives hung on the quality of your judgment when information was incomplete and time was collapsing. Patton had chosen rightly. This time. But how often could such gambles succeed? How many commanders possessed that instinct? And what happened when instinct failed and doctrine proved wise after all? The war would end soon. Hitler was already cornered in his bunker. Victory was certain. Yet Churchill carried away from the Rhine a deeper question. Wars are not won by certainty alone. Sometimes they are won by men willing to risk everything on a fleeting opportunity. Men who understand that waiting can be deadlier than risk. He would never fully reconcile the paradox. Admiration for brilliance that threatened order. Relief at lives saved mingled with dread at lives almost lost. As their jeep carried them onward into Germany, Churchill glanced one last time at the river shrinking behind them. The bravest decisions are not always the safest, but they are the ones history remembers. Subscribe for more untold moments where history turned in silence.